Hello, and welcome to our presentation on forest succession and recovery in Point Pleasant Park, also known as Amtuakati in Mi'kmaq. My name is Brooklyn McConnell, and I will be presenting alongside my group members Braden Troll and Callista Comsick. Our focus today is on the forest recovery process in Point Pleasant Park, specifically how the ecosystem has changed over the past 20 years since Hurricane Juan in 2003.
Point Pleasant Park, also known as Amnucati in Mi'kmaq, is a site of significant biological and cultural importance. In 2003, the park faced major destruction due to Hurricane Juan, a Category 2 hurricane with winds reaching up to 185 kilometers per hour, which caused devastating damage to the forest. Approximately 70% of the tree canopy was destroyed, altering the forest structure and initiating a long process of ecological recovery. The disturbance caused by Hurricane Juan provided a unique opportunity to study forest succession, which is the process where ecosystems recover and develop after such a major event. In particular, our study focuses on how the park's forest has responded over the last 2 decades. We hypothesize that the forest in Point Pleasant Park has progressed to a mid-successional stage as evidenced by increasing tree density and species richness. Furthermore, we predict that the forest will continue to recover and evolve towards a climax community, which will be dominated by late successional species such as sugar maple and mature red spruce. In this study, we are going to aim to analyze the changes in tree density and species richness over the last 20 years. Secondly, we are going to predict how the forest will progress towards its climax community. And finally, we will explore how incorporating Mi'kmaq traditional knowledge, specifically the concept of two-eyed seeing, can guide sustainable recovery for the forest. It is important to follow the progression of the park to be able to see what recovery tactics were best. This information can then be applied in the future if a natural disaster happens again in a forest of similar population. Making this information public helps in future forest recovery efforts.
The data for this study was taken from Point Pleasant Park, which is located on 5718 Point Pleasant Drive off of Tower Road in the south end of Halifax. It consists of 75 hectares of walking trails and even-aged forest land surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean and is located on Mi'kmaq territorial land. In 2003, Hurricane Juan hit Halifax and devastated 70% of the trees in Point Pleasant Park. Due to the conditions of the even-aged forest, there was no buffer of younger trees that could depress the wind continuing down the canopy, resulting in a larger catastrophic event and a larger portion of damaged areas in the park. The soil in this area was also extremely shallow, which enabled the winds from Hurricane Juan to cause uprooting. This catastrophic event raised a sudden interest in looking into secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park to look at community density differences and the result of communities hitting their maximum climax in reference to species dominance. Data was collected using tree density per species per site. The tree size data was collected through measuring the diameter at breast height using a fixed standard measurement for estimating forest biomass, which was approximately 4.5 feet above the ground for each station tree site. The species density data from Point Pleasant Park was recorded from 6 sites, with our lab section focusing on Site 1. Site 1 is located on the intersection of Ford Road and Pine Road. Site 2 was located on the intersection of Ogilvie Road and Cambridge Drive. And then study sites 3, 4, 5, and 6 were located closer to the perimeter of the park along Heather Road and Sailors Memorial Way. Sites 1 to 6 were chosen to observe the community changes in succession in Point Pleasant Park as a result of Hurricane Juan in 2003, recording 51 species of trees present. Subsequent data was recorded to show the changes in community after the hurricane over a 20-year time period, examining the relationship between total tree species density, average tree size, and community metrics in the area. The species richness, diversity index, and species evenness were then calculated annually at each of the 6 sites with considered criteria that stated a tree needed to be larger than 2.5 centimeters to be considered for the data collection to evaluate the complexity of secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park. Furthermore, the species dominance changed between red spruce and red maple trees in 2004, and the evolution of these ecological conditions were examined 20 years after the hurricane.
Following the question, how has the overall forest community changed over time and why, what can you predict will happen to the overall community as the forest moves towards its climax community, and why, the QC statement I came up with is the data collection methods followed industry standards measuring tree density consistently across study sites. The R-squared value of 0.49 suggests a moderate fit to the regression model, indicating some variability in tree density. That could be due to external factors such as human management or natural disturbances. Despite this, the overall trend supports the hypothesis of increasing density over time. This graph represents the total density of trees in Point Pleasant Park from 2003 to 2024. The regression equation indicates a moderate fit, showing that approximately 49% of the variation in total tree density is explained by the passage of time. Following Hurricane Juan in 2003, the park experienced a significant disturbance, triggering a process known as secondary succession. Early successional species have filled the gaps left by the disturbance, leading to a steady increase in tree density as seen in the graph. Looking forward, as competition for light and resources intensifies, we expect the forest to transition towards a climax community where slower-growing, shade-tolerant species like red spruce and sugar maple will dominate. Continuing on, the results shown by the total tree density graph align with what we expect to see in a forest undergoing secondary succession. Following a disturbance like Hurricane Juan, early successional species establish themselves quickly, leading to an increase in tree density. Over time, this process will slow as competition increases and late successional species, which are better adapted to stable, mature ecosystems, start to dominate. External factors such as human management of the park, climate change, and potential future disturbances will influence how quickly or slowly the forest progresses towards a climax community. The data we've collected provides a clear picture of the park's recovery over the last 20 years, but ongoing monitoring will be necessary to understand its full long-term effects.
The scatterplot regression line analysis of the red maple population density after the disturbance event of Hurricane Juan in 2003 indicates a secondary succession, indicating a disturbance that does not support the growth of new substrate but allows for potential changes in community dominance. The scatterplot in Figure 7 describes the secondary succession in the population density of red maple and the dominance change over the 22 years after Hurricane Juan. There is a significant late successional increase in the species density just before 2010 and increases exponentially as it reaches a mid-community climax. Analyzing the density differences over a 20-year period, red spruce was the dominant species in 2003. Red spruce was the leading species in terms of biomass with a value of 3.25 average over the 4 data points collected in the year, whereas the red maple density per 400 meters squared remained at 0 for each data point collected in that year. Looking at the density of red spruce per 400 meters squared, the data points on the graph create a shallow slope with a range of density points falling between 5 and 10 over 2003 and 2014. After 2015, there is a difference in range that was started by an irregular data point recorded in 2015, a spike in the population density of about 30 individuals per 400 meters squared. Proceeding in 2015, the population begins to decrease but does not surpass the 30 individual mark. The R value found for this was indicative that the relationship between time and density of the individuals was weak, thus indicating there wasn't a significant growth change in density over time. The red maple species was the dominant species in 2023. The biomass per 400 meters cubed was 0 until around 2008. In 2009, the numbers of individuals per 400 meters squared began to increase exponentially, showing a population density that increased to 440 individuals. Compared to the density of red spruce, the red maple population density was observed to have a more extreme relationship in reference to the time scale, concluding with an increased R2 value of 0.1549. This increased R2 value could be possible as a result of intraspecific competition between the two species of trees, causing the red maple to become gradually more successful. As the population of dominant species reaches its climax community, the density could begin to decrease due to competition factors as it reaches its maximum coverage capacity. An intraspecific competition inducing change in the population as well as secondary succession could help to explain the reasoning behind the gradual density increase of red maple over 20 years.
Here we are trying to determine how the species richness has changed over time and why. We also want to know our predictions and how the species richness will continue to change as the area of study reaches its climax community. As seen in Figure 8, the regression analysis shows a positive relationship with species richness over time, where the number of species in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia has increased in a steady way since Hurricane Juan caused mass destruction in 2003, showing that environmental specialists' effort to restore Point Pleasant Park after the hurricane are working. Looking at the change in species richness since Hurricane Juan in 2003, we can see a rather quick increase in richness. Hurricane Juan destroyed 70% of the tree population in Point Pleasant Park, causing a huge decrease in species richness. Environmental specialists decided to implement natural mechanisms of regeneration in the forest. However, they did remove many of the dead trees, leaving only some for decomposition, and they tried to preserve as many young trees as possible. By observing Figure 4, we can see that following the hurricane in 2003, the species richness doubled and in some cases tripled. This can be explained by the action taken by environmental specialists, as well as the natural succession of the forest explained previously. Forests that are more prone to disruption tend to be the most diverse in terms of richness. As the forest moves towards its climax community, we can expect the species richness to increase.
In conclusion, the forest in Point Pleasant Park has progressed to a mid-successional stage as seen by the steady increase in tree density and species richness. These trends suggest that the forest is on a strong trajectory towards recovery following typical patterns of secondary succession. Looking ahead, we predict the forest will evolve towards a climax community dominated by late successional species like sugar maple and mature red spruce. This final stage of succession will result in a more stable biodiverse ecosystem. Finally, by incorporating Mi'kmaq traditional knowledge through the concept of two-eyed seeing, we can ensure that the park's recovery respects both natural ecological processes and the cultural significance of the land. This approach will not only support the forest's long-term resilience, but also maintain its spiritual and cultural value for future generations.
Point Pleasant Park is in an urban area, which means that the natural ecosystem of the park is disrupted. Even though there are native Atlantic species present in Point Pleasant Park, like the balsam fir and the red spruce, there is also greater diversification of species because of the increased disruption, like Hurricane Juan. Since it is an urban park, it is a bit more difficult for it to regenerate the same way as most Acadian forests because of the amount of people that visit it and the richness of the soil. However, it is believed that there was a reset of succession in Point Pleasant Park thanks to Hurricane Juan.
Changes in climate variables, particularly temperature and precipitation, can have significant impacts on the successional pathway of forest ecosystems like Point Pleasant Park. An increase in average temperature due to climate change could speed up tree growth rates initially, as warmer conditions may extend the growing season. However, if these temperature changes are accompanied by more frequent droughts or changes in precipitation patterns, they could stress tree populations, especially species that are less drought tolerant. For instance, in Point Pleasant Park, species like red maple and red spruce, which are adapted to the current climate, might struggle to thrive under altered conditions. Increased drought conditions could lead to a shift in dominant species, as trees are better adapted to dry environments may start to outcompete moisture-dependent species. Additionally, warmer temperatures might facilitate the spread of pests and pathogens, further stressing the forest and potentially leading to declines in vulnerable tree populations. Increased frequency and intensity of storms, another possible consequence of climate change, could result in more disturbances similar to Hurricane Juan, which originally reset the successional stage of the forest. These disturbances could repeatedly push the forest back to earlier successional stages, hindering its progression towards a climax community. The combination of these factors suggests that the forest pathway to a stable late successional community may be prolonged or altered, with potentially less biodiversity or shifts in dominant species composition.
In this study, red spruce was found to be the pioneer species, as it was the initial species to have a recovery stage until the red maple species created a secondary succession event and overgrew the red spruce. Looking at Figure 6, the red spruce maintains a stationary growth of biomass, enabling for the later dominant species red maple to flourish. The red maple remains at a biomass level of between 5 and 10. Figure 7 helps to emulate the explosion of biomass just before 2010 as a result of decreased competition from the red spruce species. This secondary succession event enabled the newly dominant species to outcompete red spruce and increase in biomass. The pioneer species created a foundation to which the red maple could thrive under decreased competition factors due to the red spruce in a recovering stage. This recovery stage permits the newly dominant species to outcompete for nutrients and sunlight, giving it a better chance to increase in biomass exponentially. This allows for faster recovery of the forest as a whole, taking into consideration the decreased competition for a new species along with a recuperating species of tree that will soon thrive as well. We thank Dalhousie University and the Department of Biology for the access to a research facility to create this research analysis. We also extend our gratitude to lab instructor Allison Smith for the data analysis, data collection from Point Pleasant Park after the devastation of Hurricane Juan in 2003, as well as guidance throughout the research analysis. We also thank the Mi'kmaq peoples for the usage of the traditional and unceded land where both Dalhousie University and Point Pleasant Park are located for the data capture. Dalhousie is on traditional Mi'kmaq territory, therefore indigenous perspectives and teachings are deeply rooted in the structure of this research paper produced in Introductory Ecology Bio 2060.